Hello, I'm Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1940, on the 23rd of March, the Lahore Resolution adopted by the All India Muslim League calls for an independent Muslim state. On the 28th of March, the Anglo-French Supreme War Council agrees that neither Britain nor France would make a separate peace with Germany. In 1941, on the 25th of March, Yugoslav Prime Minister Dragiša Čoveković signs the Tripartite Pact in Vienna. Italo Garibaldi replaces Rodolfo Graziani as Governor-General of Italian Libya. On the 26th of March, the Italian Navy carries out a successful raid on Suda Bay in Crete. On the 27th of March, nationalist Air Force officers overthrow Yugoslavia's pro-Axis regime, and Hitler orders the invasion of Yugoslavia. The Battle of Cape Matapan begins off the southwest coast of Greece, and Japanese spy Takeo Yoshikawa notices battleships in Pearl Harbor are berthed in pairs. On the 28th of March, Peter II of Yugoslavia becomes king, and on the 29th of March, the Battle of Cape Matapan ends in Allied victory. In 1942, on the 23rd of March, the Japanese occupy the Andaman Islands. On the 25th of March, the first transport of Jews to Auschwitz concentration camp leaves Slovakia. On the 28th of March, the Japanese complete the invasion of Sumatra, and the British conduct the Saint Nazaire raid. In 1943, on the 23rd of March, parliamentary elections are allowed in occupied Denmark. On the 26th of March, the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands begins in the Aleutian Islands. On the 27th of March, the US Department of War releases the news of the bazooka anti-tank gun, and on the 29th of March, food rationing begins in the United States. In 1944, on the 23rd of March, Operation Strangle, a series of air interdiction operations, is launched to cut German supply lines in Italy. A bomb planted by Italian partisans kills 33 members of the SS police in Rome's Via Rasella. On the 24th of March, the Third Nava Offensive ends in another German defensive victory. German occupation troops in Italy carry out the Ardeatine massacre in retaliation for the Via Rasella bombing. Royal Air Force prisoners of war escape from Stalag Luft 3 in Lower Silesia. Of those recaptured, 50 are summarily executed soon afterwards. On the 25th of March, the Battle of the Kamenets-Podolsky Pocket begins. On the 27th of March, US Marines complete the landing on Emirau. Palmiro Togliatti, Secretary of the Italian Communist Party, returns to Italy after 18 years of exile in the Soviet Union. On the 28th of March, the Red Army captures Nikolaev, and Togliatti announces the new line for the Communist Party, which involves working with Italian anti-fascist parties. And on the 29th of March, the Soviets take Kolomyia. In 1945, on the 23rd of March, the Western Allies begin Operation Plunder, the crossing of the River Rhine. US and Filipino troops capture San Fernando on Luzon in the Philippines. On the 24th of March, American, British and Canadian troops carry out Operation Varsity, an airborne drop-around vessel in Germany. On the 25th of March, the Battle of Remagen ends in Allied victory, and the Red Army begins the Bratislava-Brno offensive in Slovakia. On the 26th of March, the Battle of Iwo Jima ends in American victory, and the battle for Cebu City begins in the Philippines. On the 27th of March, the Germans fire their last V-2 rockets. On the 28th of March, the Soviet Third Belarusian Front captures the medieval castle of Balga and completes the destruction of the German Fourth Army, and the US 80th Infantry Division captures Wiesbaden.
Well, there you have some really interesting anniversaries in this week, 1940 to 1945, and what I want to draw attention to, and it's very close to my heart, is the Ardientine massacre in Rome. So on the 23rd of March, that is, in 1944, on the 23rd of March, the day before today, the partisans carried out a bombing attack against the SS police in Rome, and the response was a massacre of more than 300 Italians in the Ardientine caves outside Rome. And I and others who will be on the Monte Cassino to Rome walk will be there on the 13th of April to show our respect at the mausoleum, which is arguably the most important memorial to the sacrifices of the Italian people in the Second World War. So I thought I would say that, and I want a big shout out to my friends in Italy that you're in our thoughts today, because today is the anniversary of the Ardientine Caves massacre. So with that, I'm now going to bring on stage my co-host, Joe Quinn. Joe, how are you doing?
I'm good. Greetings.
Great. So you're in your office again, working late. It's good to see that people are working hard to keep the economy going in these difficult times. So, Joe, any dates?
I wish I could say that what I'm doing is useful to the economy, particularly in this current crisis. But anyway, that's a matter for another time.
We all do our little bit, as St. David might say. So now, and before we bring on our special guest to talk about the crossing of the Rhine, any dates there that you want to draw people's attention to? I mentioned the Rizala Caves events. It's a very dramatic moment for Yugoslavia, and we've got Peter Caddick-Adams, who's actually based in Croatia, which was then part of Yugoslavia. Maybe you can talk about that a bit. Any other dates that caught your attention? There are quite a lot of really interesting moments.
There are two, which is 23rd of March 1940, the agreement that is reached between the British government and the French government that they will not conclude a separate peace with Germany. And I mean, in many respects, the French are banged to rights when it comes to the armistice in June 1940. Churchill rightly threatens the Rhine and Weygand and various different other front benchers. Basically, Pétain is rising to the fore very much, basically been this, the great hero of the First World War, and they passeront pas, they passeront pas for the, the Battle of Verdun. But Weygand and Reynaud at this particular point are the leading figures. Weygand representing the French military, and Reynaud as the political leader of France, who's dealing with Churchill at the time. Now, Reynaud wants to keep going. He knows that France has an obligation to Britain as an ally. And Churchill, while trying to be to placate the French and also be supportive of the French, he also reminds them of the obligations that they've undertaken back on March 23rd, 1940, which is that a peace, concluding a separate peace or an armistice with Germany, even in these dire circumstances, is out of the question. And if this happens, the British government would reserve the right to open fire on French military assets and to bomb France, indeed, as a consequence of basically capitulating to the Germans. So, and Churchill does not pull his punches. And a lot of people think that the attack on the French fleet at Oran, which killed about 1,000 French sailors, and also the dropping of a huge tonnage of Allied bombs on France throughout the war, particularly during the Normandy campaign, was completely unjustified, and that the Allies, there are some revisionists who argue that the Allied war against France was almost a greater act of aggression than the German war in France early 1940, and also the resistance that the Germans mounted against the liberation of France in 1944. That is an argument that has been made in view of the tremendous loss of life that took place as a result of the bearing of Allied arms. However, France did enter the war on Britain's side as an ally. It did enter for the same reasons that Britain entered the war. It was supposed to stand up against Nazi aggression. And in this particular regard, there was an agreement between the French government and the British government. And because of this particular agreement, which was signed, the French were banked to rights, and they were liable for the consequences of what they agreed. So in many respects, it could be argued that Churchill was completely correct. And I doubt there are very many people that would argue, given the fact that the French fleet at the time was the second largest in the world, that Churchill's actions were entirely justified, because without the destruction of the French fleet in the Mediterranean, in the terrible way that took place, it was admittedly a terrible, shocking act. But without crossing that line, Churchill risked potentially losing the war, because if that fleet had been appropriated by Nazi Germany and brought to bear against the Allies, particularly the British Empire, there's a fair chance that Britain and the Empire and the wider Allied cause, they would have lost the war.
Great point, Joe. And I'd like to draw everybody's attention to a really fascinating discussion on Paul Woodridge's World War II TV channel 6 days ago, in which he had an author specialising in this particular event. And he goes into all the complexities and subtleties. And the the British naval commanders were very reluctant to do it. They had been working more closely with the French Navy than they'd ever done before. And the commander of the French Navy at this point was, of course, Admiral Darlan, who had decided, after making all kinds of promises, that he was going to collaborate. He decided the British were going to lose. And of course, ironically, he was in Algeria in November 42 when Operation Torch took place, and he was on hand and eventually used his influence to ensure he was High Commissioner in France, against a lot of resistance from most of the Americans and the British. They really didn't want him. And the soundness, I think, that associated Darlan's appointment can be traced back to this moment. And of course, Darlan, as we know, was assassinated by a lone gunman in around Christmas 1942. There were 1,300 French soldiers who died in those Algeria. It's an absolutely shocking moment. Yeah. So, Joe, shall we move on to our first talking point?
There is one last thing that I wanted to mention. So it's also the anniversary of the Great Escape. Essentially, is it the killing of the 50 British prisoners of war? That's the anniversary for today, or is it the actual escape itself? I think it's the escape.
No, it's the escape. It's the escape, and things keep turning up. I am a great believer that the history of the Second World War has only just been written, because a friend of mine I've known for more than 40 years, a woman who's a friend of my wife, she always said that her father was in the RAF in the Second World War. And it was only recently, about 2 months ago, and I said, well, tell me more. What was he? He said, oh, he was a fighter pilot. And I said, oh, yes, very interesting. Was he in the Battle of Britain? Yes, he got the DFC twice, and he was shot down, and he was in Stalag Luft during the Great Escape, and he didn't escape. He was part of the escape committee. It's the most astonishing stuff I've ever heard. I said, for goodness sake, we're doing the conference in May. Can you come along and tell a story about your dad? If you check him out, I think it's Clifford Ellis, DFC in Bar, and a close friend of Douglas, but not a close friend. Didn't like him, but worked with Douglas Bader. So anyway, we all remember the Great Escape because of the important role that Steve McQueen played in it.
Yeah.
I mean, how can anybody complain about that? Let's go to our first talking point.
Yes.
And why are we going to talk about him, and then I'll bring in our guests.
Okay, so the reason we're talking about him being Monty, is now Monty is considered to be a controversial figure, not necessarily because of anything he did against any one country. I mean, Bernard Law Montgomery was he was a brevet major, or he was a major anyway in the army during the Irish War of Independence. So he'd been involved in the First World War, and then, like many British officers, including General Percival, who later became commander at Malaya in Singapore, Monty had served in Ireland, and he'd been basically responsible, like the major significant act that he'd been responsible for was he was responsible for rounding up the squad of black and tans that were responsible for the burning of Cork. And he was given specific instructions to beat the heads off these lads for the 3 days and force march them all the way from Cork to the port of Rosslare and Wexford and get them on a ferry over under armed guard and give them no sleep. Because of what they'd done in Cork. And there was a particular, and that came down from the British government. And there was a particular reason why he got that order, because at one point Cork had the majority of the warehouses of any port, essentially in the whole of the British Isles. And it was the last port of call, basically, before you basically took your shipping to the United States and Canada. So you had in this warehousing, which basically you had stocks and various different outgoing items of trade. You had the Churchills, the Birkenheads, Asquith, all these great liberal and conservative political leaders who'd led Britain through the Great War. They all had interests in basically the warehouse, essentially the port of Cork. And they basically own the contents of at least one warehouse or another. So their interests are very much tied up in the mercantile city of Cork and the port of Cork. And so the burning of Cork caused, sort of a significant destruction to their own personal wealth and their own personal estates. So, their interests were very badly affected by that act. It was a bit of a shot to the foot, so to speak. Well, and so Monty was responsible for achieving retributive justice on behalf of the British cabinet during the War of Independence against the men who carried out that terrible act. So he's actually remembered an awful lot more warmly in Ireland, despite the fact that he was on the other side in the Irish War of Independence. And also his father was a reverend. He was a vicar originally from Donegal who had relocated the family to England, where Montgomery was born. I believe he was born in Colchester. I'm not too sure.
No, I think he was born in Kennington, near the Oval.
Pennington, sorry, yeah, okay. But
the other thing about it is that I don't know. I think he regarded himself as being Irish, or at least partly Irish.
Yes, he always referred to himself as an Irishman, particularly when he was addressing Irish troops. And indeed, in North Africa, particularly during the Battle of El Alamein, his command tank, he had a Grand tank, which he used as a command tank throughout the battle and throughout the North African campaign. And his tank driver was a veteran, basically tank driver he had served in 1st and 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, and his name was Stephen Kennedy, and he was from Dublin. And Stephen Kennedy had a great rapport with Monty and said he was a fine commander and an absolute privilege to be around. Strict, disciplined, had a disciplined attitude, but he was really good for boosting the morale of the men on the ground. And he was loved by the majority of the officers and men who served under his command, both in the 8th Army and in 21st Army Group in Northwest Europe. And the reason that I'm portraying him tonight with that, this is a photograph that I chose for an article called How Nazi Fake News Split Allied Commanders in 1945. That's about the bungled Montgomery press statement and basically the Nazi attempt to basically bounce that off the Western Allies, basically through fake news excerpts purporting to be a genuine BBC European Service broadcast, which portrayed Monty as basically taking the credit for basically reversing the German advance during the Battle of the Bulge, which was not what was happening at all. And the British were taking no credit for doing that whatsoever. But Monty came out of this episode very badly. But this is a photograph that I used for that blog article, which I discovered. It's taken from the National Archives collection. It portrays him wearing a paratrooper jacket, and also you've got the emblem of the parachute regiment on his beret, which I think is it's a rather stinging thing to see in some ways. I know he's trying to pay tribute to the paras and has great affection for them, but obviously, given the fact that he oversaw Operation Market Garden, there's a sort of a sting in the tail in terms of him paying this tribute. He often insisted on wearing this particular regalia, and I believe he wore it around the time of Operation Plunder. which was his last. This was the last major military operation during the Second World War and in Europe that he would oversee. So he was given the lead command for commanding both U.S. 9th Army and 21st Army Group crossing the Rhine River as part in Operation Plunder and the supporting airborne Operation Varsity, which we will talk about tonight. And that occurred. That occurred about, it was 81 years ago this day, night of the 23rd and the 24th.
The Varsity was 24th.
Varsity was, but Plunder was commenced at about 9 p.m. on the night of the 23rd. So it was an overnight operation that they crossed the Rhine, and then it was supported by basically an airborne operation, basically behind enemy lines to reinforce the landings that would take place. I wanted to just close off the point by making the point that what escaped people's notice today is the 50th anniversary of the death of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. He died on the 31st anniversary of Operation Varsity on the 24th of March, 1976. So that's 50 years ago today. And it's on the 31st anniversary of the launch of the last operation, the last major military operation that he would launch in his career. And this is something that completely escaped people's notice. There was only one article that I can find online, which was on the BBC website, paying tribute to Monty on the 50th anniversary. So he's a figure that, even though he's well remembered and often commemorated in some respects, he's a person that I feel at the same time sometimes ends up being brushed to one side. And this may be because of the way he's regarded, his wartime reputation, his reputation for being brash or arrogant, and for also the mistakes, and there were many that he made as a military commander during the war. But in some ways, and this is just my token, in some ways I think his successes and the great qualities and strengths that he brought to the Allied cause far outweigh anything, any mistakes that he made or anything that he got wrong during the war. That's me over and out.
All right, so now I'm going to bring in our guests, and Peter and Anthony. So Peter's in Croatia. Anthony's, I'm not sure where you are, Anthony. Where are you?
I'm in North Devon.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I thought we'd just kick off before we get into the substance, talk about the contemporary reputation of Montgomery. Just a personal note, my father was on the bridge just before going over the Sangro, November 43, and staff car pulled up, smart salutes, and it was Montgomery, and he handed my father 4,000 Gallagher cigarettes. So for more than one reason, Montgomery was quite popular with the troops. So, gentlemen, we can have a quick, before we get into the substance, quick comment on Montgomery's reputation. Peter, let's go first with you, and I'll sink into the background. So how do you think people should think of Montgomery now on his anniversary, and from now, anniversary of his death, and further, and in the future?
Well, Eddie and Joe, and indeed Anthony, I tried to interest the media before about a few weeks ago, seeing that Montgomery's death would be on the horizon on the 24th. Set out an article for a lot of daily newspapers, magazines, not a nibble. Absolutely not a nibble. I think probably because there's another, there are wars going on around the world at the moment. But Field Marshal Montgomery, he'd be very pleased that we are discussing him. One of his concerns throughout the latter part of his life was his legacy, that he would be remembered as someone important who made a contribution to British history, British military history. And that hasn't gone away. Yes, he was what we would call a Marmite general. In other words, you like him or you hate him. There's no middle ground. And I don't think he would be too upset that was part of his legacy. In brief, that photograph sums him up quite well, actually. It's a shame it's a black and white photograph and not a colorized one, because it would show us the maroon beret of the parachute regiment, which Joe was just discussing. The silk neckerchief of the made from a bit of parachute silk, that he's wearing like a cravat around his neck. He's doing everything to sort of emulate the sort of special forces approach of the parachute regiment, but he wasn't of them. He never made a parachute jump. They never awarded his wings to him, or his beret or his badge. He took it. He took it because they asked him to be their commandant general. And that was a very astute move, because at the end of the war, he was in a position to protect them against being disbanded, which was a very real possibility after May 1945. All these special war-raised units, what was going to happen to them? Would they have a future? Montgomery protected and guarded the parachute regiment, so he gave them something back. But, an interesting person, a very unlikely person to rise to the top, born the 17th of November, 1887, as we've explored, to a fairly humble vicar from Northern Ireland, from just outside Londonderry, but who was then in the rector of Kennington Rectory Vicarage, just in London. He and his siblings followed his father around, and he was pretty soon promoted to being a Bishop of Tasmania. So a lot of his school years were either following his father around bits of the empire, or being sent away to public school, which he sort of thrived in, but he was a bit of an arrogant bully, and ends up in Sandhurst. He happens to be back-termed because he's actually bullied another student. And the foremost part of his war is the First World War, where he learns to lead and command. But most of his war in the First World War was, he presents himself as a muddy-booted infanteer. And yet nearly all his posts in the First World War were that on the staff, because he's very seriously wounded as a platoon commander in October 1914, receives a lung wound. He's awarded a DSO for his troubles. There's no military cross available then. And it's assumed that he's going to leave the army because he's so severely wounded. In fact, he fights back. He's incredibly fit, very motivated, gets himself back in on regular service, goes over to France. But all his postings till the end of the war are that of a staff officer. He's a lieutenant in October 1914. By 1918, he's a lieutenant colonel. The interwar years are lecturing in staff colleges, which is extremely important, because that's really where he learns how to put the nuts and bolts together, and alongside his staff jobs at corps and division level, so that he understands how to command and run an army in a major war. And that's what's going to come to his advantage in Alamein and all sorts of other places. And essentially, Monty is lucky. He arrives in the Western Desert at the right time, when the logistics balance has tipped in the Allies' favour. And thereafter, the sort of battles he conducts in Sicily, in Italy, and in Northwest Europe are when logistics are in the Allies' favour and not in the Germans. And so he's cautious because he's told to be cautious. Britain only has one army. He's not going to break it. And he's aware of the reputation that Douglas Haig had after the First World War. So that's the guy we're looking at. And the Rhine crossings are his show. All the Allied armies crossed the Rhine at about this time in March 1945, but Eisenhower had always agreed that the main effort would be a British one, led by 21st Army Group, which means Montgomery, and that's what we will tease out. And Anthony has written a very good book called Rhineland about the various campaigns. You're going to flash it. There we are. So this is about the campaigns from the German point of view, but all along the Rhineland in 1944 and 1945. And he and I would just sort of stress the point, really, that the battle we're going to have a look at, the Rhine crossings, led by Montgomery, whose anniversary we're nodding to today, The Rhine crossings would have happened in December 1944, but for one fact, and that is on the 16th of December 1944, the Germans preempt the Allies with their surprise Ardennes attack. And so everything that unfolds in March 1945 is the delay of really 3 months while the Ardennes battle is fought, lost by the Germans, and then the Allies have to tidy up the whole battlefield all over again, assemble their forces all over again. And the Germans don't really have anything to assemble because they've used it all in the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, very good. I'll let Anthony come in a second.
Yeah.
That's from what my comments were. And a couple of things that I read about Montgomery. He was asked, he used to ask troops, they said, all gather around, so what's your most important weapon? And they said, oh, what's the most important thing you've got? He said, well, my rifle, no. My entrenching tool, no. He said, it's your life. That's what he said to the men. It's your life, and I'm going to help you keep it. And I think that's such an amazingly wonderful thing to say. I always felt, I remember reading his biography in the last week of his life or so, and someone was talking to him, and they said, how are you looking miserable, Bernard? Why is that? And he said, I'm thinking about all the men I killed at El Alamein. And the man was with him, said, don't worry about it. When you arrive, they will all be cheering you. And I thought such a touching insight. And I've always felt that this incredible person, incredible man, needed just a bit of love. I think he just needed someone in his life who loved him. And he lost his wife. He never remarried. And he was always looking for affection. He was wonderful to his junior staff officers, wasn't he? He gave the accounts. And people attach a lot of misplaced contemporary viewpoints and what his close relationship for his junior staff officers to lieutenants. But he loved them. And he was so heartbroken in the last week of the war, one of his closest ADs. So I think one of the things we suffer from this, and I think there's no doubt about it, is the American Hollywood version of Montgomery, the presentation of him in Patton, the slighting reference to him in the Saving Private Ryan. You know, he's got the receiving end of Hollywood's treatment, and it's a very difficult thing to recover from. Anthony, got any comments? Before we get into the substance of the cross, any comments about what you think? I mean, is he overrated, underrated? Does he need to be reappraised?
Yes, I think he probably does. It always strikes me one of the problems he has is because Nigel Hamilton wrote that, you know, those 3 enormous volumes back in the 1980s, it's put people off, I think, writing about him ever since. You know, they were the definitive studies. And also, I think because Monty was so famous, there's that urge, certainly in, you know, military historian circles, to sort of rediscover lost generals. So, you know, increasingly people like Alexander, Wavell, Auchinleck, they sort of, quite rightly, but they sort of have taken attention away from Monty, if you like. You know, there's that sort of urgency or sense amongst historians that they need to rediscover someone. So a lot of British Army generals have been reassessed in recent years, but not really Monty. And I think another problem Monty's always had is that lots of the battles that he's been involved in obviously get poured over incessantly by, you know, folks like myself and Peter. And the upshot of that is he often comes in for criticism about how he handled the battle. So Monty, I think unfairly, his reputation tends to be tainted a bit on how he fought the Normandy campaign. It's certainly tainted a bit about how he fought Arnhem. And it's also tainted a bit on North Africa. You know, there's always that sort of slight sour grapes that he stole Auchinleck's, you know, thunder because he replaced him. You know, Churchill had lost confidence in Auchinleck, so it was time for him to go. But Auchinleck was actually the one that had already done all the groundwork ready, you know, had got the British 8th Army to the position it was good to go and was capable of fighting and winning against Rommel. And there's always that sort of unfair feeling that Monty then turns up and gets all the glory for it. And I think that's unfair. As a man, the inception I get is, like many men of his generation, he was very closed off emotionally. You know, I think we'd agree he was not a good husband and he wasn't a very good father. But the one thing he was good at was he really was a soldier's soldier. You know, as we've just been discussing, he did love his men and he cared for them. And again, one of the reasons, and as Peter's just pointed out, one of the reasons why he's got, I think, this unfair label of being a cautious general was actually he was a sensible general in that he knew he shouldn't be trading British soldiers' lives for ground. He always tried to ensure his operations were planned thoroughly to try and minimise casualties. And indeed, I think, as we'll get on to in a bit, Operation Plunder and Varsity are probably prime examples of that. He sort of carried over that, if you like, excessive planning for Normandy. Well, I say excessive, actually, it was first-class planning for Normandy. That sort of rush job for Arnhem. He then tries to ensure that, Allied losses are minimised before they cross the Rhine. So I think, I like him. I think he's a good general, despite his detractors. I think, he was good at his job. Again, as Peter's pointed out, he'd come up through the ranks. He'd served during the First World War. He'd served in Ireland, where he actually recognised that Britain could not win an insurgency war there. And funnily enough, just before the outbreak of the Second World War, he'd actually been in an operational theatre, of course, in Palestine, where an Arab revolt had broken out. So he helped oversee crushing that, restoring order, British control of the area just before the outbreak of the Second World War. So he really knew the job of soldiering, I think.
Okay, well, Peter is coming back somewhere. I'm going to try and find him. Here he is. But anyway, look, that's the detail. I think the thing is that, when I read about him, I feel sorry for him in many respects. He hated his mother, and he didn't go to her funeral because he said his mother beat him and treated him terribly. That's very sad, the lack of affection and love in his life. And I think he saved a lot of British soldiers' lives. Anyway, let's move on to the substance now that Peter's with us. I'm going to put a slide up. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Joe to act as host for this talk. And the first slide I'm going to put up is that. And that's an overview of the battlefield. It's the big picture. So you've got Netherlands at the top. You've got the border, and you can see Belgium. And this is the big picture overview. This is the location of what was going to happen in 23rd, 24th of March, 1945. So, Joe, ball's in your court. Take it from here.
Okay, so first question, and this is for Anthony Tucker-Jones, who's the author of Rhineland, Hitler's last defense, 1944 to 45. So, Anthony, apparently you have written about essentially the defense of Western Germany largely from the German point of view, what was going on their side, as opposed to the Allied side, which I think is a very important consideration and not one that's often been explored from that point of view. Max Hastings, I think, did it in Armageddon to a certain extent, but it was balanced with what was going on the Allied side. So would you be able to provide us with a sort of a backdrop to what takes place prior to the 23rd and 24th of March 1945 from the German point of view, sort of, let's say it can be anything between a 3-month to a 6-month basically overview, or essentially it's sort of encompassing the whole the Wacht am Rhein sort of initiative and operation, and Germany's efforts with regard to the defense of the West after the Allies succeed in taking France, after the German position in France becomes untenable and they have to withdraw eastwards. Just basically lay it all out for us. What leads us to the point where the Allies are ready to cross the Rhine?
Well, earlier Peter summed it up very nicely in that, as he rightly pointed out, by March 45, the Germans have pretty much expended all their forces. They do what they call the miracle in the West. A large chunk of troops escape from Normandy. They're re-equipped and they're rearmed secretly to create 2 new panzer armies, which of course conduct, the Battle of the Bulge. And in many ways, what the Germans should have done really was kept those 2 armies back, one on the Rhine and then one on the Vistula, withdrawing back to the Oder, and kept them as mobile reserves to counter any river crossings. But of course, Hitler gets it into his mind that if he can capture Antwerp, he can drive a wedge between the British and American armies, and also it will deny the Allies the port. It will push back the Western Allied war effort, and then he can move those Panzer armies to the Eastern Front and counterattack there with similar results. But of course, as we know, that doesn't happen. But also, what it means is while he's regenerating those armies, his generals on the Western Front are pretty much got to fight with what's to hand. So they have to scrape together all these sort of Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, reconstituted infantry units. For the Ardennes offensive, they create these new things called Volksgrenadier divisions. So a few of those are released to help on the Western Front. And the other thing is that Hitler's generals have to do is they've got to reconstitute the West Wall, which the Allies know as the Siegfried Line, which had been built west of the Rhine to counter the French Maginot Line back in the 1930s. And by late 44, it's in a real poor state of disrepair. All the mines, all the guns, barbed wire and everything, of course, have been moved west to be used on the Atlantic Wall to try and fend off D-Day. So all that's left pretty much are the bunkers and the trenches, and they've got to be refurbished in a rapid hurry. But while that's done, of course, it means Hitler's armies have got to fight to the west of the Siegfried Line, the West Wall, and also to the west of the Rhine. Now, logic dictates Hitler should have withdrawn his armies to the East Bank and then make the Allies pay dearly to get over the river. But he won't let his generals do that. So essentially, the problem facing his commanders in the tail end of 1944 is that they're going to have to hold on to three principal areas. One of them is the Rhineland to the north, roughly where you can see 9th Army there. In the middle, you've got the Saar-Palatinate area, another industrial region. And then further south, you've got the Alsace, another industrial region. And Hitler is determined to keep hold of those, A, because they screen the Rhine and the West Wall, but also, of course, they're full of raw materials. There's coal mines, iron ore, and all the rest of it. So that's the problem that he's got, is that his generals pretty much are denied the initiative because they are, once the Ardennes offensive has died, they are very, very firmly on the defensive with what's available. I think that probably sets the scene. I say that, and I suppose to cap it off, I mean, the important thing is the crucial battles for the Rhine actually take place on the West Bank. By the time it comes to the point where the Allies are getting over the river, the Germans don't really have anything with which to stop them, at least of all to drive them back over the river. So those battles on the West Bank really prove to be quite crucial.
My next question, Anthony, is I suppose it's more of a personal one out of personal interest than anything. Had the Rhine always been seen as a sort of a traditional defensive barrier by Germans, by Germany? Had it been seen as sort of this bulwark against possible, sort of the incursion of hordes from the west, basically, upon Germany's sacred territory? Was there this impression, and I'm not talking about Nazi ideology or Wagnerian theory, I'm talking about something that's much deeper, that even predates the days of Wilhelm II. Was this very much part of not less Nazi but more German thinking at that time?
Yes, I mean, I would very much agree with what you just said. Hitler had first seen the Rhineland during the First World War and claimed he loved the region so much that he went back on holiday there every year. But I always argue, and I certainly argue in the book, is we kind of think of the Second World War starting in Poland in 1939, but really it starts in the Rhineland, because of course I think it's the 7th of March 1936, Hitler remilitarizes it, and that's when he really first tests Britain and France's stomach for a war in Europe. Pretty much what he does is he bluffs. End of Second World War, the Saar and indeed the Ruhr and the Rhineland, they'd all been taken over by the Allies. By 36, the Saar has been reincorporated into German control, as is the Ruhr. Only the Rhineland on the West Bank is still demilitarized. But by 1936, British and French troops had left. So it literally was demilitarized. No one's got any troops in there. And the Germans, under the terms of the treaty, are not supposed to have troops there either. But Hitler decides to sort of test the waters by marching over the Rhine bridges onto the West Bank into the Rhineland to see what Britain and France do. He also has a sound reason to do it, because by reoccupying the Rhineland, what it does is it pushes Nazi Germany's air defences further west, which are, of course, are crucial for the defence of the Ruhr, which is to the northeast of the Rhineland. It's crucial for air defence, which, of course, as we see later in the war, proved to be quite a prudent decision. And he has a very tense sort of 24, 48 hours in 1936 to see whether Britain or France are going to do anything. And of course, Britain's not really in a position to militarily intervene. The French don't want to do it on their own. And certainly in the British media, there was sort of a sense of, what's all the fuss for? Hitler's marched back into his own back garden. It's German territory. So we let him get away with it. And of course, he then proceeds to repeat that process continually throughout Europe to the point that we get to, the invasion of Poland, which then finally triggers full-scale war in Europe. So I say, my view is kind of the Second World War really starts there, because that's when that's when Hitler begins to flex his military muscles.
Very good. Yeah, it's an interesting point. All right. So, yeah, we've established how important the Rhine was to Germany and to Germany's sense of, the defense of it, the national homeland. It's a very key region. It's also a central industrial region. The Rhine, even today, continues as a sort of it's the economic lifeblood of Germany. Basically, flows along the banks of the Rhine even today. I remember my parents attending my cousin's wedding and coming back and talking about the amount of trade that they saw, and essentially in logistics that they saw going up and down the Rhine River, because obviously there's ports, on North Sea ports, that essentially are accessible from the Rhine in northern Germany and also in Holland as well. And you have barges that are the size of ocean-going ships coming up and down the Rhine. And my mum spotted 250 tractors that have been manufactured in Germany, just sitting on the flat bulkhead of basically this Rhine River barge. And she was absolutely astonished, because what she realized she was witnessing was the sheer industrial might of Germany in the modern age, really. So it's very clear that this is a very centrally important economic area. How important was it? It was obviously very clearly important, but how important was it at the time that the Allies were preparing to go across? What state was it in? What part of the Rhineland industrial zones was in any way salvageable after the bombing campaigns that had taken place? The Allied bombing had reached a very critical phase at this particular point. So how much of it was actually working at this particular point that was in a usable state to support the German war economy and support the war effort in the defense of the Third Reich?
I mean, it's worth noting your comment on Rhine barges. Of course, famously for Operation Sea Lion, Rhine barges were pressed into service to be used for the invasion of England. So it shows you how big they were, and there were a lot of them. And of course, at that stage for the Germans, the concept of landing craft hadn't really been developed. So they were going to try and get across the channel and ship their troops and all the rest of it in Rhine barges. In terms of your question on the Ruhr, I mean, Nazi Germany had factories and industries scattered everywhere. But if you like, the Ruhr is sort of the beating heartland of, the Nazi war effort. By late 1944, we've obviously had the aerial battle of the Ruhr, because there's been the Allied strategic bomber campaign trying to stop Hitler's weapons factories producing stuff, and that had reasonably good results. But the real problem that the Germans are facing by this point in the war actually is damage to railways, and they're running out of raw materials as much as anything. That's the thing that's beginning to cripple them. I mean, if you think Hitler was able to regenerate 2 panzer armies in late 1944, clearly those factories are still churning out a lot of stuff. So the Allies are actually, in my mind, quite a way off from shutting the factories down. It's Albert Speer that's telling Hitler things that Hitler doesn't want to hear, which is principally that they're running out of raw materials. As the Russians are overrunning Eastern Europe, they're losing access to Hungarian oil, nickel, iron ore, all these sorts of things that they were plundering from the occupied territories. They are losing access to. Oil was becoming critical. The Allies have been, systematically bombing their synthetic oil plants, which is manufacturing oil from coal, because they can't get a hold of regular oil supplies. So it's really raw materials that are beginning to run out in terms of the factories. But of course, Hitler really doesn't want to hear about that. And then also, I think for the Allies, the Ruhr sort of becomes the ultimate goal. That's really why they conducted Operation Market Garden. It was to do that hook right, across the Rhine in the Netherlands, and to try and get round behind the Ruhr. And that's partly why, as Peter pointed out, Eisenhower sort of signed off on Monty doing the major crossing, because his forces, 21st Army Group, are to the north of the Ruhr. So if the Americans break through to the south, they then can envelop that huge industrial area. And they know that once they do that, it really is pretty much end of game for the Nazi war effort. They won't have access to those factories. As you've said, they're not going to have access to using the Rhine to ship stuff up and down it. They're going to they'll lose all the, the coal fields in the Saar and in Alsace and in the Rhineland. So at that point, it really is crunch time, which is another reason why, of course, the Germans are desperately trying to hold the Allies on the West Bank.
I have a question here before we move on to Peter Caddick-Adams on what was going on the Allied side of the Rhine. But the question is from Rob Crane. There's a few questions, actually, but I'm just going to, because we're talking about the Rhine crossing, it's a little bit more prescient. How much was the Rhine being used for river transport by this time of the war? Presumably they had to move by night if they were moving at all. And by this stage, presumably not moving at all, but after D-Day onwards. So this is basically a question about the use of the Rhine River in this particular respect. I think you've addressed that to a certain extent in your answer, Anthony, but it was just a quick question. Was the river at all being used, or was it entirely, was it effectively an Allied control even before the point that they crossed it? If you're aware? I'll go with Anthony first, and then I'll come to you, Peter, about that.
Yes, the Germans using it as much as they can. For them, the key thing is, do they or do they not blow up the bridges? Those are the real main issue for the river itself, is because, of course, they need to keep them open. His generals need to keep them open so they can withdraw their forces to the East Bank. Hitler's brain, which is working the other way, is going, we need to keep them open so I can ship reinforcements onto the West Bank to counterattack. By this stage of the war, Hitler's playing with flags on maps of units that don't really exist, or only units in name. So there's this ongoing battle between, Hitler's generals and Hitler himself on what to do with the bridges. In terms of, obviously, all the railway lines, and of course, the bridges are crucial for getting ammunition, and supplies and what have you across the river to the armies on the West Bank. In terms of shipping stuff up and down, it's a bit of a headache, because obviously the Allies have got air superiority by this time, and then probably in a lot of places air supremacy. The Luftwaffe is pretty much busy trying to defend Germany's cities rather than providing tactical support for its armies. I've got a marvelous photograph, which I should have shared with you, of the bridge at Duisburg, and the riverbed looks like it's got measles, because it's full of bomb craters, where the Allies themselves have been trying to drop the bridge into the river. And of course, hitting those bridges actually is very, very difficult. They're very thin targets to hit, because, of course, the Allies, what they wanted to do was they thought, well, if we drop the bridges, it then traps Hitler's armies on the West Bank, and we can surround them, and we'll do sort of a Falaise type operation, to trap large pockets of German troops. So I think at this stage of the war, it's a long-winded answer, but this stage of the war, I think the crucial thing really is probably not so much, and Peter might know better, it's probably not so much the river traffic that's going up and down it, it's what's coming across it that's at that stage crucial for the German war effort.
So we're now going to go to Peter Caddick-Adams. Do you want to come in on this particular point?
Yes, I mean the River Rhine, and you mentioned it actually, was, I mean, if you see it, I mean, it's much wider than a river in the United Kingdom. It's much longer, and it's never lost its principal role for trade. And that point about barges going up and down is very well made, because that's the role the Rhine has fulfilled in Europe since Roman days. And it had a military significance from the Romans onwards, and as such is part of the nervous system of Germany throughout its history and the Third Reich. Anyone coming near the Rhine rings alarm bells in Berlin or wherever your German capital is. And so, yes, trade before the Second World War went up and down. That has stopped. Allied bombing has completely obliterated the barge traffic, which now runs when it can by railway. And there's a report I remember just after the Rhine crossings of one of Montgomery's ADCs talking about the only thing visible in the River Rhine was the funnels of the tugboats that used to tow the barges up and down, and they had all been sunk. So by 1945, the utility of the River Rhine is in its bridges going backwards and forward, for troops going backwards and forwards. And we see this notably in the Battle of the Bulge. It's those bridges that take the logistic load that feed the panzers going westwards. And then slowly in February and March, they're all dropped. The last one being the Ludendorff Railway Bridge at Remagen, which the Allies have been trying to destroy. And you can see the thrust there. There's the bridge, a typical Rhine River bridge. You get a sense there of just how wide an obstacle it is. And for the Allies, and particularly Eisenhower, there was always a sense that the war in Europe would revolve around two main amphibious actions. The first was D-Day, crossing the Channel and invading France. The second was also crossing a wide gap. And I mean, you know, the Rhine typically is a mile and more than a mile in some cases of a water gap with quite swift flowing water. The Allies always foresaw that crossing the Rhine would be as dangerous and as bloody as D-Day was in their minds. And they equated the two operations that would need equal amounts of planning, equal amounts of logistics, equal amounts of amphibious capability, and they might receive the same sort of casualties for both. We now know different, because the Second World War didn't pan out like that. But that was always at the back of the Allied planners before even D-Day. And then when we come up to the Rhine, there's still this horrible feeling that in December 1944, the Germans gave us a bloody nose with a really unpleasant surprise. And although logic dictates that they haven't got anything else left in the war chest, that they've already scraped the bottom of the barrel. But in attacking across the River Rhine, is it possible that they've hidden some nasty surprise and it's all going to go horribly wrong? So the Allied plan is to reinforce massively and to bring up every asset that we have in the Canadian, the British, and the American and the French military systems, just in case, the contingency of contingencies, just in case things start to go wrong. And to give us a context, can we go back to that big map, which shows the different incursions across the Rhine? There, that's the one. Okay, so essentially we've got four armies. The Second Army under British command and within 21st Army Group, alongside British Second Army, commanded by a very nice man who doesn't get any attention at all, Miles Dempsey. And temporarily assigned to Montgomery is Bill Simpson's 9th US Army, which is a fantastic organization led by the only pro-British general the only pro-British American general in the whole of Schaeff, and that is a very tall Texan called Bill Simpson. And that's the army group that's really going to take the lion's share of the Rhine crossings as we know them, that we're going to tease out today. Then you've got sort of First Army a bit further south, and they are going to, they have already seized Remagen, or they will seize and exploit Remagen in a way that hadn't really been anticipated. This is just really, a week or two before Montgomery's main effort. And then if we flip back to the other map again, down in the south, you've got a Third Army who are going to, for reasons of their own, and this is largely Patton's beef with Montgomery, and although they're told to let the British cross first, technically the Patton unleashes some troops as a sort of almost as a spoiler to try and get across the Rhine before Montgomery and technically succeeds. And then we keep forgetting that the Sixth Army Group down in the south has the 7th American Army and the 1st French Army, and they do a whole series of crossings down at sort of Karlsruhe and Strasbourg and places like that. That will take them into the Black Forest, and that is why the French come to garrison in the Cold War the whole of sort of that beautiful area of southern Germany, as a result of their activities in March 1945. And those troops have come up from the south of France. They've come up from Marseille and Toulon and places like that, which they've invaded on the 15th of August 1944, the other D-Day that everybody forgets about. So it's a huge array of Allied manpower on the River Rhine that have all reached there and are now adjacent, raring to get across the water and not be flung back. And if we look at the 3 army groups, 6th Army Group, 12th Army Group in the middle, 21st Army Group in the north, it's over 3 million men. And if we look at what the Germans are fielding, yes, it's their home territory, so you give them plus points for that. They know the ground, but they haven't got anything like the resources that the Allies have. The Allies are over-resourced. Their air power is just a huge steamroller effect. But this sheer amount of troops, armored divisions, the number of tanks they have on call, and this is where the capture of the port of Antwerp or opening of the port of Antwerp in November 1944, which is one of the triggers for the Battle of the Bulge, is hugely important because all of the Allied logistics for Montgomery's 21st Army Group and Bradley's 12th Army Group come essentially from Antwerp. And that's all the fuel, all the vehicles, all the rations, all the ammunition, everything. 6th Army Group, 7th Army, you can see quite clearly there, they're getting theirs from the southern French ports. So this is a campaign that's driven by logistics. And if you get your logistics right, then you are in the driving seat. And that's really what's going to happen in the early part of 1945. But that's why it couldn't really have happened any earlier. We've mentioned Arnhem, Montgomery's attempt, and you can see Arnhem right at the top there in astride the Dutch bit of the River Rhine, trying to outflank the German Siegfried Line defences. That was never really, let's be honest, that was never really going to make the running because we didn't have the logistic support. We might have achieved Arnhem, we might have crossed the River Rhine, but we sooner or later we'd have run out of fuel and other things like that. So the way the war unfolds into 1945 is probably the way it was always meant to, given that this is a logistically driven campaign.
Okay. Now I have a map that is going to sort of portray. I think Eddie's moving to the slide of the Bridge of Remagen, so I'll address this briefly. So we're all familiar, or I mean, those of us who, shall we say, as Al Murray calls us, afflicted, we're familiar with the movie Bridget Remagen, which actually was featured on BBC recently. I didn't get to watch it all, and I've only watched the whole movie, I think, once. I've seen bits of it a couple of times and whatnot, and I think it's a rather odd, strange movie. I think it's like George Segal is a little bit like an overpowering wine, you know, sort of you partially enjoy it, but it's sort of you start to become a little bit, I don't know, fatigued by his performance, whatever. I've seen him in a lot of movies, and he has the same effect on me every single time. Kind of just the nonchalance is a little bit just too much.
I think it's absolutely brilliant. I really, it's one of the few movies that does anything to address warfare after Arnhem until the end of the war.
Well, that's true.
And I thought Robert Vaughan, you know, is played as a very sympathetic German who is caught in a catch-22 situation, and he acts the part quite well, and it's scripted quite well.
I agree with Peter. I actually quite like it. I agree with you, Joseph, about your point that it's a very, very much a 60s movie. So it's got that underlying theme of war is hell. I mean, they kind of do that in all those films, don't they? Which actually almost spoils it because it feels slightly heavy-handed. And like you say, the George Segal character is almost out of place, isn't he? That he feels kind of
just a little bit, yeah.
But I think I would, if you've only seen it once, funnily enough, I rewatched it before I wrote the book. So I would recommend go back and have a look, because I think what it captures really, really well is that sense of chaos within the German High Command, that sense of bandit country on the west bank of the Rhine. You know, because the movie opens with this reconnaissance unit sort of driving hell for leather through the German countryside to get to the bridge to capture the Germans by surprise. So I think in that respect, you know, and the German attempts to blow it up and it doesn't come down and all the rest of it, it's within the remits of a Hollywood movie. I think it's pretty accurate. You know, if you spoil the reality of it, it was filmed in several locations, so it's not all the same thing. And, you know, it's that suspension of disbelief. But I think in terms of showing you the Germans' inability in certain areas to keep the Allies away from the river, and also with Remagen, the irony is it sort of persuaded the Americans that the Allies could bounce the Rhine, you know, particularly Patton, who couldn't understand why Monty had cleared the West Bank in his area by the 10th of March and then spends 2 weeks getting ready. You know, Patton couldn't understand that. It sort of did his head in. It was like, no, let's just go over. Let's hit the German. Patton's mantra always hit the Germans on the run. Let's get over, which, as Peter said, you know, he did on the 22nd. He got some units over and did it again. So Remagen sort of convinced certainly the Americans that maybe they could bounce the Rhine. The irony with getting over the river there was that actually the geography was not good for a breakout, and also it was too far south from the Ruhr. So what it turned into, I likened it to Aachen. So Aachen became an unwanted distraction for Eisenhower to the north, you know, just before the Ardennes offensive, and Aachen served Hitler really well. Because although that was the first German city to be lost, it distracted the Allies while he rebuilt his panzer armies for the Ardennes offensive. And Remagen works in reverse, that Hitler is so furious that the bridge has been taken and tapped by the Americans. He conducts a witch hunt, but also insists on sending lots of reinforcements to that area, which the German commanders could not spare, to try and contain the American bridgehead. I can't remember what the figures are. You end up with something like 3 American divisions over the river being contained by 8 German. So it ended up tying down desperately needed German reinforcements that were needed elsewhere in an area, you know, because on the east bank, the geography, it rises up very high, it's hilly, it's wooded, it's not good tank country, actually. So even if the Americans had got out their bridgehead, which they do eventually, their progress would have been slow. But it serves a purpose in that it signals to the Allies actually German defences on the Rhine are not good. I say it signals to Patton that actually maybe they can bounce the Rhine on the move, and that you don't need, you know, weeks of prep, which is what you know, Monty does. Because again, that's going back to the start of our conversation. That's one of the criticisms that Monty gets, is that, you know, the Germans knew that he was going over between Wiesel and Ries because his preparations had been shrouded in smoke for weeks. Reconnaissance aircraft had been flying up and down the river for weeks. He was massing, masses of bridging equipment, pontoons, Buffalo tracked amphibious assault vehicles, Duck Ws, as we discussed at the beginning. They'd actually shipped landing craft south from Antwerp, via the river where they could, or on flatbed trucks. So there's all these massive preparations going on. So the Germans knew exactly what Monty was going to do. And in the meantime, Americans at First and Third Armies are already over the river. But I say that ironically, the crucial bit of the puzzle is the Ruhr. That's really why where Monty cutting along the north and then Ninth Army along the south. It's once they create that pocket. But I think going back to my original point, good thing with Remagen is it does give you that sense of chaos, because certainly again in the Saar and the Alsace, the German armies begin to disintegrate very quickly. It sort of becomes every man for himself, desperately trying to get back to the river, to get over to the river and safety, which is, again, one of the reasons why at Remagen the bridge had been set up for demolition, but they'd held back for as long as they could from blowing it up, because obviously they were desperately trying to save German troops and civilians fleeing onto the East Bank.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I have, I brought up one particular map for Eddie to show, but this map will suffice for the moment. So you have an outline of basically the order of battle for this is the main operation. So we're just going to basically pretend that essentially all that Patton did basically down south, that Remagen was an accident. They got across, they got an intact bridge, and they got troops across, but they obviously can't break out because you've got very difficult country that once you get into sort of the East Bank. And then also Patton gets across as well. There's the famous incident where Patton basically rings Bradley up and says, "Brad, I'm across," and all this kind of stuff. And then Bradley's in the middle of having a cup of coffee, and he nearly chokes to death on a mouthful of coffee once he hears that Patton's across the river. And so Patton's getting across, so he's using buffaloes. Patton has a certain amount of buffalo and ducks and different other sort of amphibious vehicles down in his particular sector, but he doesn't have what he needs to get nearly enough across. He has the bridging equipment and everything like that, and that's the key thing. But the main effort, where everything has been diverted, is it going to be in the sector of 21st Army Group, which has also attached to it Simpson's 9th Army. And it's important to sort of bring this back. So, Peter, I would leave this to you, but it's a very exciting nugget of mine. The Ardennes offensive, for all the crap that basically was thrown at Monty in the aftermath of his press conference on the 7th of January, the fact of the matter was, ironically, the result of basically the Allied armies being split by the Ardennes offensive resulted in Monty being attached, having a U.S. Army commander attached to him, who, funny enough, was the only one that he ever truly got on with, and that was Bill Simpson. And Bill Simpson wouldn't have necessarily, I read somewhere that he wouldn't have necessarily been regarded as an Anglophile by any stretch, that he was a simple Texas man that basically, sort of a very good, reliable, solid, tactical commander, had done fairly well in West Point, but he wasn't regarded as the brightest spark, but was actually turned out to be a very capable army commander and very, very dynamic. But actually his key talent was the way in which he had a diplomatic element to his character. And after, sort of receiving the first few, shall we say, forays or blows of Monty's very famous, arrogant disposition, he quickly got the measure of Montgomery and was able to work around him. And they formed an extremely good working partnership, which basically leads us to the Rhine River crossing, Plunder and Varsity. Essentially, what happens is you have Dempsey's 2nd Army under 21st Army Group, so which 21st Army Group includes 1st Canadian Army and Dempsey's 2nd British Army, Within Dempsey's second British Army, I can't remember the name of the other corps, but you have the famous 30 Corps, which took part in Operation Market Garden, which will include famous units such as the Guards Armoured Division, which will include the Grenadier Guards Armoured Battalion, as well as the famous Irish Guards Battalion under Colonel. Just trying to remember his name.
You're thinking Joe Vandeleur.
Vandeleur, Colonel Joe Vandeleur, who basically, actually, I interviewed a veteran who his last major military operation. He only came in at the tail end of the war. His name was Anthony Aymer, and he was the last surviving Second World War veteran to command the Irish Guards Regiment. He retired in 1980. Wellington Barracks, incidentally, is just across the road, just behind me, and that was basically Anthony Aymer's home for a number of years, and Joe Vandeleur's. But basically, they take part in this operation, both Joe and the gentleman that I interviewed, Colonel Anthony Aymer, and Anthony Aymer described sort of the amount of bridges that were laid during the operation. But it's important to remember that this was a combined operation. It involved US elements as well as British elements. It was not just the British moment to shine. The US 9th Army and also the supporting Airborne Division, the US Airborne Division, which came in alongside British 6th Airborne on the eastern side of the river as part of Operation Varsity. Was it the 15th Airborne? Sorry, I keep forgetting which airborne it was. The US Airborne Division that took part.
17th.
17th, sorry.
Yeah, 17th, yeah, British 6th and US 17th.
I think there are a number of things to be observed from this operation before I hand back over to you, Peter. What I observe is this is basically the last great example at a point in the war where the Americans and the British weren't necessarily working that closely together, that they were now operating almost in isolation from one another, rather separate. But this is an example, sort of they had their own kind of command responsibility in their own particular areas of the front, and they tended not to rely on each other as much as they had done during previous land operations. But in this particular, that's one point that I would make. But in this particular operation, they are working in tandem. You have one US Army and one British Army basically working alongside one another with supporting US and British airborne units. It's the last great example of this partnership working successfully. And in addition, also, when we talk about the lead up to the Rhine crossing operation, they were genuinely petrified. There was, during the Alta conference, you had one of the top US commanders asking General Antonov, who was representing, I think, the general staff of the Soviet army, if they would be prepared to share any advice or guidance that the Soviets might possibly proffer from their very considerable experience of crossing rivers, including large, long, or wide rivers, throughout the course of their advance across Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. To which the Soviets basically said they'd get back to the Allies and never did. But the Allies came very well prepared. They had naval elements, they had Air Force elements, and they had ground units. They even used Royal Marines in river crossings, I think at Xanten. So this is also the last great example of a superbly, expertly executed combined arms operation. And I've written about this in an article in 2020. So what I suppose I want to next lead into, Peter and Anthony afterwards, is I suppose what was the ultimate, given the fact that the war was coming to an end, what was the ultimate objective of Operation Plunder and Operation Varsity, other than the obvious? What was the short and long term strategic objective that would spring from basically getting the Allies en masse across the Rhine in this major bridgehead in order to crush Nazi Germany once and for all and end the war? What were their considerations?
Well, Joe and Anthony, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you set the scene very, very eloquently, but between you. Let's stick with this map, which really does sort of help us. And there are 2 points to make here. One, the first is that Monty spends his time getting all his assets up to the river, spreading his elbows, as it were, marking out his territory, and taking every possible precaution to make sure that this doesn't go wrong. And he's doing this for several reasons. The Rhine crossing is the culmination of every single tactical and operational level that 21st Army Group, and before that 8th Army, has learned ever since Alamein. You've got the 1,000-gun barrage that sets off the attack crossing the Rhine. That's something he used at Alamein. And everything else, from sort of creeping barrages, from mine clearing operations, to the use of tactical air, to the use of paratroops that we see with D-Day, it's all brought in. And we have to say, is this overkill? The answer is there is a bit of overkill there, because Montgomery knows that when the Second World War ends, so does his career as a field commander. This is his advertisement of what he can do, and it's Britain's advertisement of what the British Army can do for the rest of the world, for the Germans, for the Americans, for the French, and for the Soviets. In other words, Montgomery takes everything out of the train sets, or deploys his full train set. Everything comes out of the toy cupboard because he can. It's his last hurrah, because once the war is over, that will be his last job. He, if he's lucky, he'll go on to become Chief of the Imperial General Staff, which he does. So this is the tour de force. Now, if we look at that in overall purpose, you can see the detail of that map, and in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got a tiny little sort of postage stamp of Germany, which shows you what the detail is here. And I mean, essentially, Montgomery is going to use this to do quite a few things. The 1st and 2nd American-Canadian Corps in the Canadian Army are going to fan out north and occupy and liberate the Netherlands. The 2nd British Army, which has got several corps, but essentially 30 corps, and we've just mentioned them, is going to go up to sort of Cuxhaven, just on the Dutch-German border. 12 Corps is going to go right up into Denmark, and it has a crucial role because we soon discover there's a race between the Brits and the Soviets to seize Denmark. And the last thing Eisenhower or Montgomery or anyone else want is for Denmark to be under Russian occupation, because that means they can close the Baltic. Already there's the tensions of what will become the Cold War already unfolding at the beginning of 1945. 8 Corps goes up to Kiel, and on the way they're going to take places like Hamburg, Lübeck, and Osnabrück. And this maps out where the British Army is going to be right through until we withdrew them in ending in 2016. So this is the story not just of the Rhine crossing, but of the British Army in northern Germany for the next sort of 60-odd years. The ambition is huge, and actually things develop rather as the Allies intend. However, if we come down to look at 9th Army territory, you can see that opposite Simpson's 9th Army is the Ruhr. And Anthony's told us a lot about the industrial capacity of the Ruhr, and its western edge is the River Rhine, but you can see the River Ruhr snaking its way eastwards from the River Rhine, or it flows into the Rhine. And that whole area there is full of shed loads of German factories, hugely important. And it's absolutely vital that we capture them so we completely dominate and can turn off German war manufacturing capability. And that's going to be surrounded by a very clever maneuver. So Simpson's 9th Army is going to cross the Rhine on Montgomery's southern flank. It's then going to envelop the Ruhr on the northern side. And you can see a hint of that from the immediate deployments across the river. But coming from the southern side of the River Ruhr, we've also got the 1st US Army, and they are going to snake their way across when they cross the River Rhine and envelop the River Ruhr from the southern side. And the two armies, the 9th and the 1st, are going to surround the River Ruhr. And that's basically where Army Group B under Field Marshal Model has got the lion's share of their fighting capability, because that's where they think that the priority German defense is. They're going to be completely surrounded, and that's where Model eventually concedes defeat and indeed commits suicide. So that is hugely important, what's going on Montgomery's southern flank. But essentially, we've got this major operation. It's divided into two halves. So Varsity and Plunder. Plunder is the amphibious crossing, and again, we're so well skilled now. We've taken Walcheren, we've done the D-Day operation, we've also done operations in southern France. There's probably nothing we don't know about crossing opposed water obstacles, and also we've got all the kit to do it with. Not just landing craft, which Anthony kindly reminded us have come all the way from Antwerp and have been brought across the channel. So exactly the sort of Saving Private Ryan type craft that are then deployed on the River Rhine to ferry troops across, but DUKWs, smaller things that are sort of jeep sized called weasels, buffaloes, which are specially devised, but they're the LVTs that we associate with the US Marine Corps fighting all their wars in the Pacific. All of these have been brought in and have a degree of protection, or certainly amphibious capability. And the Germans really don't have anything like this at all. I mean, they've got an amphibious jeep and that's about it. This is a reflection of the Allied war machine. And we bring it not to an ocean, but to a river. And it's all perfectly designed. To Plunder is going to use all of this kit overnight, initially sending commandos across, and then a lot of troops in the early hours in Buffaloes. We've also got swimming tanks. So the Sherman DD duplex drive tanks, which we associate with HR on D-Day. And to be honest, I'm not a great fan of them because they did suffer quite a lot in approaching several of the beaches. They're redeployed for the Rhine crossings. And my old regiment I used to serve with in the Territorial Army, the Staffordshire Yeomanry, who were a D-Day regiment using DDs, return to the fray with their DD tanks, their amphibious tanks, and are there one of the first regiments across with the River Rhine supporting the 51st Highland Division. So that is the morning of the 24th and the night of the 23rd. And then the other half, which is Varsity, is the airborne operation. And you can see the two British airborne divisions there, British 6th Airborne, American 17th Airborne, 6th, of course, veterans of Normandy, 17th, new to combat. But we're very keen to deploy them. Now, what is an airborne corps of two divisions doing, deploying after the main assault has gone in? Because in Normandy, it's airborne first and amphibious troops second. And here you can see drop zones on the eastern side of the River Rhine and a series of amphibious crossings over from west to east. And the real point of the matter is that if the whole operation is going to be preceded by 1,000 plus artillery barrels placed wheel to wheel, then you're going to wipe out your airborne troops. The other thing about Normandy is it taught us that paratroops and gliders launch en masse at night into difficult terrain, particularly swampy terrain where there are rivers involved, is a recipe for disaster. That's why Arnhem was always a daytime mission, and that's why ever since British and American airborne forces used in any series of numbers are always deployed by day. It's simply too difficult an operation to manage by night, and you don't get the sort of force multiplication effects. So, given that Varsity has got to happen by day, but you need to sort of seize the sort of amphibious, the land troops work really well at night. So Plunder comes in by day, and again, because the ground troops have seized all their objectives, people quite often say, well, what was the point of the airborne operation? The point was it was reinforcing the land and amphibious operation, and was certainly there to provide support had anything gone wrong, and were the Germans defending in a measure that we hadn't anticipated, and defending much better than we anticipated. They don't. Most of the German units are swamped. The paratroopers come in and they make an enormous impression. This huge tour de force of hundreds of troop-bearing, paratroop-bearing C-47s, and all the gliders that are towed in as well. I mean, it is a spectacle. It's laid on as a spectacle. It's there partly to subdue the Germans by psychological means. It has all sorts of valid military points as well. And it's there to support these guys. And I suppose the proof of the pudding is that Winston Churchill, old war dog that he is, wants to see this in person. He's been denied the opportunity to get on the cruiser HMS Belfast, travel across the Channel on D-Day itself, and be off the coast of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, which was his dearest wish. He's been banned by Eisenhower and the King. But he has said, I'm going to see the Rhine crossing, and it's very difficult to say no to him. So there he is. He watches it with Allenbrook and Montgomery. They watch the aerial armada go across. They watch troops going across, and then Churchill says, I'm going with them, and no one can really stop him. And here he is on a Buffalo. If we look there, we've got certainly Dempsey, we've got Montgomery. I think there's probably some other divisional commanders. There's Ramsey there. I mean, that must be, no, it can't be Ramsey, he's already dead, but there's a senior naval commander. That must be the most star-studded Buffalo crossing the River Rhine ever. And had that been taken out, that would have been a severe shock to the Allied command system. But Churchill wanted to set foot on the east bank of the River Rhine, pottered up and down, then insisted on going into Simpson's territory, where he clambered over one of the railway bridges that had been destroyed but was still navigable, walked around with Bill Simpson, and then came under sniper fire. And Simpson said, right, that's it, we're going back across to safety. I don't want to be part of the demise of Winston Churchill. And of course, the whole reason for this is that Winston Churchill, born in 1874, first came under fire on his 21st birthday in Cuba, wanted to be under fire again for the last time in his life. And just like Monty knew that this was his last campaign, and therefore he pulled out all the stops. That's I think psychologically, this is the real reason why Churchill was there. He wanted to smell the whiff of grape shot for the last time in his sort of war leading career, and he got his desire. He was with Allenbrook the entire time. Allenbrook writes in his diary that when Simpson says, that's it, we're going back across to the west side of the River Rhine, we're under fire. Churchill looked as though he was a school kid who'd been building sandcastles on the seashore, and his nanny had called him away and said, right, enough of that, Winston. I mean, the look on his face was apparently exactly the same, and it's a lovely, lovely word picture that Allenbrook uses in his memoirs that captures the moment instantly. But these are the debates. Was Plunder Varsity massively overinsured? Yes, I think it was, but there are deeper reasons there, and one of them is Montgomery's conceit and vanity, that he wants this huge, impressive military display of everything that his army group can do. I think deep down he understands that Churchill also wants a display, and so does Brooke, of British military capability for the Soviets. And you know that the difficulties of working with them, in a sense they might be a future opponent, I think is there, and I think this is, you know, part and parcel of that. Don't get any clever ideas about invading Western Europe. Look at what we've got, and even if we disband at the end of the war, we can pretty soon reconstitute this. And by the way, you know, we are experts at river crossings, by the way. So, you know, just bear that in mind if you stray in the wrong direction. And here you can see the way, you know, some of this pans out. The Canadians do take and liberate most of Holland, so that's very much a sort of Canadian show. And we assign the 1st British Corps under Harry Carrar's responsibility as well. The British Corps largely are self-contained and do their own thing. You can see sort of 30 Corps there snaking their way up to Bremen, and then going up into sort of the direction of Kiel. Who have we got? 10 Corps, 12 Corps, 8 Corps. They're heading to sort of major centres like Hamburg. And then you've got the 9th US Army, which will seize the River Rur. You can see the 1st US Army down at the bottom, and the 9th between them. They surround the River Rur, shut it down, and capture it. And then the 9th Army goes all the way. Originally, they were going to go to Berlin. They don't. They go to Magdeburg, which is on the River Elbe, and Leipzig also. And those two cities are really pretty much the furthest eastern advance that the Allies make, because the Soviets are coming in, and the River Elbe is pretty much the eastern maximum area of sort of penetration. That's the sort of demarcation line between the Allies and the Western Allies and the Soviets. It's worth just saying that Montgomery only spends 30 pages of his memoirs talking about the Rhine crossing and the end of the Second World War, because so much of these final battles are overshadowed by the American effort. Eisenhower doesn't spend much more, and neither does Bradley. And there is this sense that once we're across the River Rhine, it's all over. And that's really why I wrote my book, Victory in the West, because it isn't by any means. There's a lot of tough fighting. Concentration camps to be liberated that we just don't know about. We hadn't conceived of anything like Belsen at all, and that's, you know, right within the British area, and it comes as a huge shock. And I think, you know, one of the things I uncovered is that a lot of Allied soldiers, not just a few, but most in one form or another, tripped over the Holocaust. All the slave laborers being liberated. The Nuremberg trials told us that 12 million were enslaved by the Third Reich and imprisoned in dire circumstances. So most Allied soldiers encountered these poor people, never mind, you know, those actually in physical concentration camps. And it traumatized an awful lot of soldiers coming home. I mean, you know, PTSD is, we understand what it is now. And there's a good illustration of it actually in the Bridget Remagen film of soldiers who just can't cope with the continued pressure. But actually, an awful lot of Allied soldiers gained some kind of PTSD by liberating the camps or liberating all these slave laborers. And of course, it's never recognized because it's not the normal combat. And they got no treatment or help for it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make the point that actually it's 2.5 to 3 weeks after the British and Americans crossed the Rhine that Bergen-Belsen is liberated on the 15th of April. So it, like with with the crossing of the Rhine, you have huge swathes of Germany, huge cities, basically concentration camps. They're all coming very quickly within Allied custody and control. I believe when I first came across the story of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, that actually what happened was the Germans requested that the British send forth an entire Royal Army Medical Corps brigade as soon as possible through their lines into Belsen to immediately get to work, because a typhoid outbreak had occurred and that they were evacuating the camp. And this is even before the British had actually, this is the story that I came across. I'm not sure how much truth there is to it. I found it since very difficult to back the story up, but this is originally when I first came across the story of the liberation, this is what I was told. I just wanted to come back to Anthony very quickly, because I know that we're due to finish up very soon. Anthony, in the same way that Peter has outlined how the Allied unfolded their war effort, would you be able to guide us through just very briefly how the German defense of the Third Reich ultimately collapsed under the weight of basically the Allied incursion into across the east to the eastern bank of the Rhine, and basically into the heart of Germany, into the plains of Germany, where essentially, effectively, the Nazi German Reich collapsed in the space of about a month. Could you outline how that collapse took place?
Well, Peter's marvelous brain has rather made me redundant. Could we go back to is it third one back map that you had up that Peter spoke to? One before that. Keep going. Next one, is it? Yes. Yeah. I'd say, I mean, Peter pretty much covered all the bases. I would make 3 observations on Plunder Varsity, one of which is timings. So it's worth remembering that they're all staggered. I mean, as Peter pointed out, the airborne operation took place the following day. So essentially you've got Rees is 9 o'clock, Wiesel's 10 o'clock, Dinslaken, which is a 9th Army, is 2 o'clock in the morning. And then the following day at 10 o'clock, you've got Varsity launched. So all that helped to keep the Germans off kilter, because it didn't all happen at once. It's sort of staggered. Which brings me on to the point of Varsity. As Peter pointed out, some discussion as to whether or not it was a waste of time or it actually, significantly contributed to the operation. From the Germans' point of view, the main thing it does is it ties down their reserves. So it causes chaos in the Germans' rear areas. And crucially for the Germans, it means their 47th Panzer Corps cannot interfere with the river crossings. Now, that sounds very grand. It's 2 armoured divisions, 2 panzer divisions, but they're very weak anyway. And the upshot is that those units are basically sent chasing their tails. In fact, 116th Panzer Division ends up heading south to a non-existent airborne landing. The intelligence is wrong. So those 2 airborne divisions, I think the crucial thing they do is that they land on top of German units. They tie them down, and they also very briefly suck in whatever. You can see, so they're quite scattered, but what they do is they suck in any mobile German units onto them, thereby again preventing them from intervening in the river. So that's quite important. If we can then go back to the earlier map, the key thing is, as we bring our discussion full circle, the key thing is the Ruhr, because the Ruhr, again, as Peter mentioned, Army Group B under Field Marshal Model becomes trapped there, not through design, but through Hitler's insistence that they do not give up any ground. So it means you have 320,000 German troops trapped in that pocket with no viable defense lines. They're out of ammunition, they're out of fuel, and the chain of command pretty much collapses. And again, as Peter mentioned, you've got Simpson's 9th Army on the northern flank there, and on the south, the US First Army. They link up to the east of the Ruhr, a place called Lippstadt, and they do that on the 1st of April. So that seals off that pocket. And then on the 14th of April, the Americans cut it in 2, thereby trapping 2 pockets. And the Germans don't surrender because Model won't authorize it. He's not given permission by Hitler to surrender. So essentially what happens is German defence just sorts of fade away. Local corps and divisional commanders start making their own arrangements with American commanders. But what it means is by the 21st of April, the Germans have lost 320,000 troops that they cannot replace. They've lost an entire army group on the Western Front. So at that point, pretty much the war in the West's over. As Peter pointed out, it then becomes a case of how much space and territory can the British, Canadian, French for that matter, and the American armies cover east of the Rhine. It just becomes a land grab, really. Unfortunately, in places, the Germans continue to resist. But that crucial factor, the loss of an entire army group, which really is the crowning triumph, if you like, of Operation Plunder. We kind of, we lose sight of what its goal was. Yes, it is to punch eastwards. Yes, it is to go north and trap the remaining German units in the Netherlands. Yes, it is to get to the Baltic coast to try and stop the Soviets taking over Denmark. But the real crowning glory is that Ruhr pocket and the loss of 320,000 troops on the German side. So that really brings, the war to an end on the Western Front. I mean, obviously it drags on until 8th of May, so there's another week or two to go. But the Germans cannot mount a viable defence from that point on.
So very quickly, just before we conclude, there weren't many questions fielded, but I suppose Paul Kelly did have a question for you, Peter. So if Arnhem had succeeded, is PCA saying that it would have been a waste of time anyway? Would the Allies have been thrown back across the river? That's the question from Paul Kelly, who incidentally, Peter, would love you to come to Northern Ireland sometime, to Belfast, to do a talk in the Ulster Reform Club. He wanted me to say that to you. If you could find time in your packed schedule sometime.
Well, you heard it here first. You heard it here first. I'd be delighted. So,
okay,
if you can reach out to me, then we will. We'll conjure up a Northern Ireland tour. So, if we're, I forgot what was the last thing you wanted me to address.
Oh, it was a question from Paul. So if Arnhem had succeeded,
Arnhem.
It would have been a waste of time.
The point I was trying to make is that all of these successful Allied campaigns are logistically driven. And Arnhem is 60 miles from British lines to the final bridge along a single corridor. And we don't quite make it. But had we made it and seized the bridge and got over, what does that then give us? It still gives us a slender corridor. In the vicinity is German air parity, not Allied air supremacy. And logistically, that's a very tenuous Allied effort to support. Okay, you've got 30 Corps going along there. You've got various Allied airborne divisions, 3 of them defending different parts of the corridor. But that's still a really, really tricky axis of advance. If you're then trying to project that into Germany, and at the same time trying to widen your narrow corridor, which is only one road, given the preponderance of German combat ability in the area, on land and in the air, could you support a major thrust into Germany down that axis, all the way from Antwerp through Arnhem over the river? I don't think you could. And given that the Germans would be targeting every bridge that they possibly could, including the Arnhem Bridge, I'm not sure that plan, to my mind, it's too hasty, and it wouldn't have delivered in the longer term what Montgomery was trying to do, which was thrust into Germany and avoid bloody combat trying to bulldoze his way through the Siegfried line, because his logistics tail would have been wasted by the Germans either by land or air or both. And he would have lost more men, possibly, in the Arnhem operation had the tactical objective of Arnhem actually been seized in the first place. I'm not a great fan of Market Garden.
Okay, I think that's everything from me. There were a few other comments in the bar, including from Rob Crane, who just said this is less a question. I'm hoping to find out where COPP, Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, did beach reconnaissance before Plunder. Site currently unknown, and the details are all a bit sketchy. For the Alb River crossing, they recce DD tank landing places, but also where the Royal Engineers were going in to ground their bridges on the far bank, saving time on the day of the assault. So I'm hoping my research finds out if they did the same for Plunder. I had an Irish person from whose grandfather, I think, was originally from Sligo, who was in the Royal Engineers 21st Army Group, possibly involved in Operation Plunder, and also Sean Scullion, who was on the show previously.
Oh yes, yeah.
Sean is Royal Engineer himself, and of course, Operation Plunder and the Rhine crossing is one of the great triumphs for the Royal Corps of Engineers in the Second World War, and it's a sign of basically how important, well, how central they were, not just in terms of the basically the building of bridges and the role of but also combat sappers under fire, basically during that operation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point worth making that by 1945 we are using Army Groups Royal Engineer and Army Groups Royal Artillery, AGRAs and AGRIs. In other words, we are using our assets, our artillery and engineer assets, at the operational level. And they're deployed in unprecedented quantity, and those are the enablers, not just in terms of building bridges, but everything else that comes under, particularly the engineering banner. For example, you mentioned the smoke screen. The whole area was covered in obscurity from the German point of view for pretty much 2 weeks. So the Germans knew what was going. The Germans knew the location of what was going to happen, but they didn't know how. And keeping up a smokescreen for 2 whole weeks is no mean feat. Never mind all the transport assets of getting landing craft all the way to the riverbank. I'm not sure the pilotage parties did recce the German far bank. I think by now what we've got is very, very good tactical air photography that's taking masses and masses of low-level photographs of the river, coupled with lots and lots of tourist guides of the River Rhine produced before the Second World War. And those collectively, not just actually in the British sector, all the way along, give us a really, really good insight into suitable places for making amphibious landings with your track vehicles and all the rest of it.
Eddie, all yours.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. It's wonderful. I really learnt a lot, and I'd like to thank Peter for his magisterial approach to the strategy, Anthony with his more detailed and granulated view. Buy their books. They're astonishingly good works, available online or any good bookshop. And so I'd like to say thank you both. There you go.
Yeah, put up your book, Anthony. Yeah.
We're playing that game, are we?
Yeah. So Anthony's book is Rhineland, Hitler's Last Defense, 1944 to 45, which was published in October last year. Out in all good bookstores.
I'm with all these books, and there's at least 20 books a month being published on Second World War history internationally in the English language. It's astonishing. I can't think of another sector of human activity where there are so many new books being produced, and a lot of original work is being done, or people revisiting books that we thought the history was established. And a bit like what goes in one end has to come out the other. And I think there's a need for a good secondhand Second World War history book shop somewhere, so that people at least could clear out their shelves occasionally. No matter which, you know the problem, don't you guys? It makes sense. But I suppose
part of the book.
Well, yes. Well, I tend to do that. I keep them in my basement, which is sort of halfway between the shelf and the graveyard. So what I wanted to say is that the first thing is the operation led to around 7,000 casualties on the Allied side. So, I mean, it was less than the total Allied casualties on D-Day. in Normandy. So by the standards of what happened then, comparatively light casualties. Nevertheless, 7,000 young men who never returned, many who did return, but many of them are still there. And so think about them when you think about this operation. I'm very struck by Anthony's point that the really byproduct of this campaign was the Ruhr, and the fact that 350,000 German troops were then collared and eventually surrendered. So it was one of those operations which I think the price paid compared to the outcome delivered was astonishingly productive. If any battle, if there's ever a battle that can be said about, this is one of them. And I think it's echoed also by Operation Grapeshot in northern Italy, my father was involved with, where all the lessons of the past, the experience, the generalship, the close cooperation amongst the allies, technology and everything delivered a very swift end with comparatively low casualties and an end to the terrible war. And then history started, did it not, that we were raised in. So look, thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to put you into the green room and I'm just going to say a few words of farewell, but I'll be back again in a second. Anyway, that's it. So thank you very much to our guests. It's an astonishingly interesting show about a very important moment in the Second World War as it leads up to its climax and final end. So that's it for today. So for everybody here this week in the Second World War, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.